Hello once again, this is History 322, Modern East Asia, Week 2. I'm hoping to do this in 2 recordings. If you've seen movies such as Argo, that's A-R-G-O, the movie about the 1979 Iran hostage crisis, you'll have seen a depiction of history that is loaded with extras that make the story more appealing to the audience. And the same thing goes with things like Band of Brothers and some of these movies you'll see in this course, actually, The Sand Pebbles and Year Living Dangerously, and so on. These are movies that are set in a historical place and time and give you a decent idea of some of the background, but they're not meant to be historically accurate. They don't actually follow events in, typically speaking anyway, in a faithful way. But they will give you the flavor of the times if they're done well. And they are necessarily summaries of what happened during that time. Just as this course has to be a summary, and this lecture certainly has to be a very brief overview of this period leading up to the first part of the 19th century, the early 1800s, in Southeast Asia. So I just want you to keep that in mind, that we'll be doing a lot of, this will be a very high-level introduction to that period that's meant to introduce you to the central aspects of this course, events in the mid-late 19th century and going on to the 20th. Let's go on to slide 2. So we're going to talk about how Southeast Asia was transformed into a bunch of colonies and why that happened. This is a sort of a why 1800 moment. Why does this course begin in 1800? 1800 was, or the years surrounding it, was the watershed all over the region between mere trade in consumer goods between East and West, between Europe and Asia, and the acquisition of vast amounts of raw materials by Western powers to serve their needs during the Industrial Revolution. This was one of the big drivers, and we'll get deeper into that as we talk in this hour. Mainland Southeast Asian kingdoms were more resistant to Western incursions as the 19th century progressed, but only Thailand ended up being resilient. Then it was known as Siam. Siam did not change its name to Thailand until 1937. There are nuances through this, including how Australia slowly became more relevant, very, very slowly. But Australia is highly relevant today to East Asia, and Australia is a continent-sized country, in spite of its low population. And it's a main ally of the United States. It's been nicknamed the America's deputy sheriff in the region. Of course, that's not meant to be a compliment. So I want to introduce the first part of why those sorts of things happened. Let's go past slide 3, which tells us that we're going to talk about trading outposts. From there to regional control, and go on to slide 4. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal began its great exploration to the east and to the west and the south. You can see on this map where the Portuguese established themselves, and they did not so much establish colonies that they would exploit and peoples that they would virtually enslave, as was done later by other countries, and indeed by the Portuguese themselves in Africa. But they were after spices, they were after cloth, They were after ceramics. They were after all these different things that governments didn't really want, but that investors wanted. So this exploration was driven partly by, of course, by the priorities of the crown, of the king and of Portugal, but it was also driven by commercial imperative. In other words, people would book spaces on ships that would sail to the east, and they would give money to the shipping company that was running the voyage. That money would be used to buy up commodities that were for sale at great profit at home, and then these ships, if luck was with them, would make it back, and whoever had invested a substantial amount of money, really a big gamble, in these voyages, scored really big once the ship returned with all this stuff that was greatly desired. It was stuff that was easy to make in the places where it was found, hard to make or acquire in Europe. It included things, as I mentioned, like pepper, that not only preserved food, helped preserve food in Europe during this time, when there was no refrigeration, of course, to adding decent flavor to otherwise bland cuisine. So that's why it went for such a high price. But really the important part here is that before this time, contact between East and West was done overland. It was very dangerous and very expensive to ship commodities between Asia and Europe along an overland route. It was still somewhat dangerous, but a lot less expensive to do so by sea. And this is why the Portuguese developed this big network of trading entrepôts. And again, they were only entrepôts for the most part. They tended not to be, there are exceptions, especially in Africa, but they tended not to be actual colonies. Let's go on to slide 5. And a colony, of course, is where somebody really rules and makes all the laws and takes vast amounts of land. The Portuguese had established themselves in the 15th and 16th centuries, but then along came the Dutch, who were better armed and had faster ships, and things dissolved for Portugal. They managed to stay on in India until 1961 at Goa, until the Indians threw them out. They stayed on in Macau until 1999, mostly because the Chinese wanted them there, and we'll discuss more about that later on. But the vast majority of their colonies were displaced before the 17th century ended. And of course, the 17th century means the 1600s, just like this is the 21st century. Going on to slide 6. So what were these things? I guess I got ahead of myself a moment ago, but spices, cloth, ceramics, luxury products generally, they're produced at reasonable price and quantity in Asia, but then were sold at a higher margin elsewhere. You can see that there is two-way trade going on here. You can see to and from on this slide. And so this trade was highly profitable again. Basically, commercial imperative was driving this trade, this exploration. It was not a desire to grab vast amounts of land. That would come later. And this is because this was not the age of manufacturing. This was classical trade, closer to the Greeks and the Romans trading across the Mediterranean than it was to anything in the following centuries. Let's go on to slide 7. So, at a high level, the regimes on the Southeast Asian mainland were had their core areas where the people of the dominant ethno-linguistic group lived. They had their peripheries, and they had their enemies beyond. Naturally, they were wary of invasion. A notable example, from before the 7th century is the Khmer Empire, that's spelled Khmer, the Khmer Empire, centered on modern-day Cambodia, which controlled everything for about 300 years, I think. West all the way to India, east all the way to the Vietnamese coast, and south all the way to the Malay Peninsula. So each of these big kingdoms had their enemies, and they and their enemies tended to trade territory and a give and take over the centuries, depending on leadership, depending on circumstance, depending on population, demographic advantage, and so on. But we contrast this now to maritime Southeast Asia, that is modern-day Indonesia for the most part, and to its east, Melanesia. Maritime Southeast Asia, the stakes were simply not as high. The populations were relatively small. The kingdoms were relatively small. They were generally along the coastlines. They traded across the water as a tradition. So that meant that they were not locking people out like the mainland regimes tended to. Slave trade was common between them. There were wars, there were raids, but these conflicts were simply not as lethal. They were not existential conflicts, in other words, conflicts that could lead to the end of the existence of one of the sultanates or kingdoms. They were more like squabbles. I'm really simplifying this, but they were more like squabbles than the wars of life and death between the regimes on the Asian mainland. Going on to slide 8. Compared to today, the Asian mainland regimes were also sparsely populated, but in general they had many more people than did the maritime kingdoms. The modern mainland political entities like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand expanded and contracted, as I said a moment ago, as they competed with each other. There were fewer complications in those days that we see today with globalization, where large commercial interests that are not under the control of governments become very interested in maintaining a level of peace. You may think that there are a lot of wars in this era that we're in, but this era, while it certainly has its wars, it has its problems, is generally more peaceful than previous ones, and this is because of, I hate to say it, but it's because of, partly because of globalization and the way that economies have become integrated. So during this period, these were defensive, very self-reliant kingdoms who, and by the way, their rulers often considered themselves to be the descendants of some god or other supreme being, and they ruled as such. These are not ideas that were confined to Southeast Asia. They were also common in other parts of the world, including China and Japan. Interestingly, not so much for Korea. And these three main kingdoms in the last part of the independent period for Asian countries, I've summarized their basic aspects here. A lot of this is from the reading. You should be doing the reading. I don't want to take the time to go through this bit by bit because I want to underscore for you that when you're writing your papers and when you do the final exam, you're going to be tested on not only what's in the lectures, but also what's in the reading. It's very easy for me to see who's done that kind of work and who hasn't. So I'd like you to make sure that you look at the readings in the Owen, the Modern Southeast Asia textbook that's edited by Owen. which has a lot of these details in it. Suffice to say that these were all successfully centralized kingdoms, but there are some basic differences in them which we'll go into now. So go on to slide 9. Modern-day Burma, which is called by its present military regime Myanmar, the actual name is Myanmar. That R should be silent, but nobody ever does that. Anyway, their king, Bodapaya, at the time when the British first were appearing in Asia, that is, they were making their inroads into India through their commercial interests. Through their commercial interests. Bodapaya was a very energetic leader, and he was a leader of historic consequence. Not only did he expand Burmese influence to the west and to the east, but what happened was he ran up against the British. The reason that this was a problem was that the British were just entering India at this time. They were slowly taking over the individual kingdoms that existed all through India, and they had decided that they wanted to grow tea on a commercial basis in large quantities in Assam. That's A-S-S-A-M, Assam. And Assam borders Burma, and the reason this was so important, we'll get into later, was basically because tea was very expensive and popular in the West. Tea was coming from China. It was costing too much money. The British decided to look for ways to solve that problem. One of those ways was exporting opium to China. Another of those ways was to produce tea. But they had the Burmese bumping up against them. So the British undertook the best defense, which is offense. And over the course of 35 years, more or less, they took over Burma. Hands off our tea. Hands off my infusion, I guess. Going on to slide 10. Unfortunately, Bodapaya's successors, who ultimately were confronted by the British over this 3+ decade period, were less aggressive and competent, especially compared to the Thais and even the Vietnamese. King Mindon of Burma, who is prominently featured in your readings, understood the British threat, but he didn't understand the other half, how to negotiate with them, nor did he really understand his position, that is, his own military capability compared to the British. The British did understand, however. They had their people on the ground, and they assessed the Burmese armed forces, and they rightly and quickly and correctly concluded that it would not, it would be a one-sided struggle, although it would take time. So the British began their forward and aggressive policies at about this time in the 1820s and 30s. It took, as I say, over 30 years for them to overcome Burma, but they did. And in retrospect, the reason that this is so important is that this seems, in retrospect, like Burma was a guinea pig of sorts for British policies that followed in the rest of Asia, rest of East Asia. And you could go back, I suppose, to India, where the East India Company had established itself as a favored British enterprise. But in retrospect, it seems like the policies that the British pursued of using the demand for trade to advance militarily bit by bit, taking 35 years to absorb Burma, were later applied to China. Now I'm going to stop here, and our next recording will begin on slide 11.